Sure. Thanks for the invitation. So my name is Simonida Kacarska. I run the European Policy Institute in Skopje. It's a think tank that deals with European integration of the Western Balkans. I myself have been in and out of the country most of my life. I'm a political scientist, and I've focused most of my professional and academic work on European studies, actually, having studied in Bulgaria and the UK predominantly. I have two kids that I hope will get to live to be European citizens, European Union citizens, actually. So that's my biggest motivation for my work. Yes, you're right. Macedonia is the longest standing candidate, actually, for European accession, probably after Turkey. And it signed its Stabilization and Association Agreement already in 2001. Together with Croatia. So it started with its journey together with Croatia, so hence the candidate status in 2005. But then it fell prey to the many crises in the European Union. It fell prey to the economic crisis, afterwards to the refugee crisis, but mostly it fell prey to the policy of nationalization of enlargement policy and the use of bilateral disputes in this process. The country effectively had a veto for the start of its accession negotiations from Greece from 2009, because this is when it got the recommendation to start the accession negotiations, up until the signing of the Prespa agreement and the change of the country's name for internal use in 2018. And afterwards, it actually fell prey to another veto from its eastern neighbor, Bulgaria, related to many issues of history and identity, rights of the Bulgarian community in the country most recently. But in the meanwhile, I would not say that everything was actually so bleak. As a result of the fact that it started so early on, North Macedonia now, Macedonia back then, is actually one of the best aligned candidates for EU accession. It's even though it has only started the accession negotiations very recently, it's actually comparably aligned as Serbia and Montenegro that are negotiating for a very long time. So besides falling prey to the developments in the EU, it had also its own democratic backsliding for a certain in the midst of 2015-17. It went through major political crises, most of them also linked to the in one or another way to its prospect of EU accession. For Macedonia, there's a lot of firsts or a lot of modifications of the process itself. But to simplify it, so we completed the screening process, and in order to move to the next phase, to hold the second intergovernmental conference, the country needs to adopt constitutional changes which relate to the insertion of the Bulgarian community in its constitution, which has been hotly debated and contested at the political level in the country. The government currently does not have the majority to do that. It did not have it last year. This obligation is part of the European Council conclusions attached to our negotiating framework as a result of the compromises or accommodations that have been made for Bulgaria to actually lift the veto that I mentioned before in 2018. Having been in this process for a long time, the country actually has the advantage of having trained structures to coordinate the European accession process, which were an advantage to complete the screening process itself. It has a very good start in many of the areas, such as which are substantive for the EU acquis, such as, for example, areas referring to the common market related to food safety, customs. These are actually very well-performing areas, but it lags behind in many of the areas, as the region does, which would relate to protection of the environment, which is the most expensive chapter, as we know from the previous enlargement. And there's a lot of challenges still in the rule of law area, as in many of the countries of the region, but also in the European Union. The current hurdle, as I said, going back to your last point, is actually the adoption of the constitutional amendments because from this moment onward, the country cannot hold a second intergovernmental conference without it, as this was the conditions in the council conclusions last year. I think North Macedonia is a small country. Currently, 1.8 million people live here. But also the entire Western Balkans is rather small. And I think that now we are realizing actually how small it is. It's not more than 16 million people, officially 18, but every day less. So from this perspective, it is very difficult to single out what is the key benefit that the union of 500 million will get. But having said that, we must look in the historical distance that actually North Macedonia was the country where the EU's foreign policy, which is becoming increasingly more important, especially people are becoming more aware of it for the last 2 years, at least after the Russian invasion, actually started off in North Macedonia. So the EU tried and tested its peacemaking abilities on the ground, and in 2001 it managed, together with NATO, to actually stop a short-lived conflict in the country. Some of the first missions of the European Union were actually implemented here. So it's actually from where we stand, North Macedonia is actually, by getting into the EU, I think the Union will complete its circle of a well-performing actor in foreign policy, which is something that it has been struggling with for a very long time. There are other arguments that if one of us makes it, Montenegro or Macedonia usually, then it would actually send a good signal, and it would show that enlargement is actually alive, because this is the longest period in EU history that we've not had enlargement. But I'm not a supporter that much of that argument, although I find it appealing. But I think that bottom line, the entire Western Balkans is an investment for the EU to be able to reconfirm its role in foreign policy. Bottom line, I would fail to miss that actually North Macedonia, if there's one thing in the region that it stands for, is that it's probably the only functioning multi-ethnic democracy that we have. Is the only country in the region that actually shows a unity in diversity, and most of its institutional structures have been shaped in a way to accommodate communities in the view of this country becoming an EU accession member. So I think that at least for this generation where I am, and I'm already gonna be 42. I started working on this when I was 22 or 23. I think that for this generation, it was actually integrating a diverse country, a multi-ethnic country in the EU would actually show that the way of multilateralism and the way of compromises actually works, and it's a meaningful way to lead a country. And I think this is a big signal that the EU needs to send.